May 29, 1453, the day the world shifted. The legendary walls of Constantinople, stone ramparts that had guarded an empire for over a millennium, that had survived sieges from Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and countless others, finally collapsed. These were the last walls protecting the dying shadow of Rome, and now they lay in ruins. Through the smashed gateways rode Sultan Mehmed II, only 21, brilliant, relentless, and determined to seize the city every Muslim commander since the Prophet's era had dreamt of conquering. Historians call this moment one of the greatest turning points in human history, the death of Byzantium, the fall of the ancient city, the final breath of the Middle Ages, and the beginning of a new world. But hidden inside this vast historical event is another narrative, one that scholars avoided, chroniclers encoded, and survivors refused to speak aloud for more than 5 centuries. It is the story of what occurred in the immediate aftermath of the city's fall, deep inside the imperial palace, far from the battlefield, in rooms where no soldier's shout could reach. A story centered around Princess Theodora, a young Byzantine noblewoman whose fate became so politically dangerous, so morally disturbing, and so explosive that Ottoman writers concealed it in ambiguous language. Byzantine refugees buried it in shame, and later historians quietly removed it from public memory. What Sultan Mehmed II did regarding Princess Theodora was not ordinary conquest. It was not simply the seizure of a defeated noblewoman. It was an event that would haunt the Sultan personally, reshape Ottoman policy toward Christian elites, and generate a scandal so troubling that empires united in wiping it from the record. When you finally understand this story, you will understand exactly why her name was erased for over 500 years. Before we descend into this forgotten chapter, and, trust me, every detail matters because the truth is far more unsettling than most people realize, I need you to do 3 things. First, like this video. It took months of translating Ottoman archival material, interviewing Byzantine historians, and reconstructing scattered, deliberately hidden fragments. Your like tells the platform this work is worth seeing. Second, subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we uncover the fates of the other Byzantine princesses. There were more, and what happened to them is somehow even worse. Third, comment Theodora to bring her name back into existence after centuries of silence. Now, let's return to that morning, because the hours immediately after the fall sealed Theodora's fate. The siege had gone on for 53 days. 53 days of relentless cannon fire from monstrous artillery Mehmed had commissioned specifically for this conquest. Cannons so gigantic that teams of oxen pulled them across the countryside, and entire squads of engineers managed them. 53 days of watching the ancient walls crumble under half-ton projectiles. 53 days of starvation, dwindling numbers, and the slow realization that the 1,000-year-old capital could not be saved. Emperor Constantinople, Palaiologos, the final Roman emperor, understood the end long before it arrived. On the night of May 28th, he gathered the remnants of his court and commanders inside the Hagia Sophia, the jewel of Orthodox Christianity. Catholics and Orthodox stood together, their divisions meaningless now. They prayed in the same cathedral where emperors had been crowned for almost 1,000 years. When the prayer ended, Constantine removed his imperial garments. He refused to die as a monarch hiding behind walls. He would die as a soldier. According to the few accounts that survived, he said, "The city falls, but I will stand. I am emperor, and I will die with the empire." He kept his word. When the Ottomans finally poured through the breached defenses before sunrise, Constantine ran into the chaos, fighting until he vanished under a crush of bodies. His corpse was never definitively found. Some said the Ottomans cut off his head and presented it to the Sultan. Others claimed he died anonymously, stripped of everything that marked him as ruler. Either way, the Roman Empire from Augustus in 27 BCE to Constantine XI in 1453 ended on that blood-soaked morning. While the emperor chose death, countless nobles tried desperately to survive him. This is where Princess Theodora enters the narrative. She was not Constantine's daughter, he had none, but she was tied to the imperial line through the interwoven marriages of Byzantine aristocracy, most likely a niece or cousin, though the exact relationship was intentionally blurred later, perhaps to distance the imperial family from the scandal that followed. What we know for certain is this: she was extremely young, likely between 14 and 17. She was considered extraordinarily beautiful, raised in a culture where noble women's beauty was crafted as political currency, and she was unmarried, an anomaly for a Byzantine princess of her age. Why was she unwed? That single detail becomes critical to everything that happens next. Byzantine princesses were almost always married by 13 or 14 to secure alliances. Theodora's unmarried status suggests one of two things. Either she was being held in reserve for a monumental political marriage, potentially to a Western prince who could provide military aid, or she was meant for the church, possibly already pledged to a monastic path. Whichever the case, it meant that when the walls fell, she was in a uniquely vulnerable position, caught between political value and religious protection, and within hours she would be found by Ottoman soldiers, and the true nightmare would begin. Some scattered accounts suggest Theodora had been promised to the church, marked for a monastic life rather than marriage. If true, it explains not only why she remained unwed, but why her fate during the city's collapse became especially horrific. Because when the Ottoman army finally burst through Constantinople, the world she knew unraveled instantly. The city plunged into the chaos that always followed the fall of a medieval stronghold. Later, Ottoman writers tried to paint Mehmed's conquest as disciplined and merciful, but the first 24 hours were anything but. These were soldiers who had endured nearly 2 months of starvation, bombardment, and endless casualties. They had been promised the city as spoils for 3 full days, according to military tradition. Mercy was not what they carried into those streets. The bloodshed was overwhelming. Estimates of the dead ranged from 4,000 to 30,000 in a single day, a massive swing that reflects both the confusion of the moment and the propaganda churned out afterward. Churches were ransacked, homes smashed open, women assaulted in alleys and courtyards. The elderly, the sick, anyone who couldn't be sold as a slave, was often cut down where they stood. This was the grim reality of medieval warfare on both sides. But Mehmed had issued specific directives regarding one category of people: the imperial family, the highest nobles, and the men and women whose intellect or lineage could be politically useful. Those individuals had to be taken alive. Their capture meant leverage, ransom, legitimacy, especially for a young sultan determined to present himself as the rightful inheritor of the Roman imperial tradition. The Byzantines knew this all too well. In the desperate hours between the wall's collapse and the soldiers reaching the palace district, aristocratic families scrambled to decide their fate. Some disguised themselves as servants, hoping anonymity would save them. Others barricaded themselves inside churches, praying sanctuaries would be respected. They weren't. A few fled through underground tunnels or toward the water, only to find Ottoman ships sealing off escape routes. The palace itself was a mazar, sprawling self-contained city built over centuries. Gardens, shrines, libraries, hidden rooms, tunnels known only to the imperial household. By the time Ottoman soldiers arrived, parts of the complex were already burning. Whether the flames had been set by desperate Byzantines trying to keep treasures out of enemy hands, or by accident in the chaos, remains unknown. What is clear is that once Mehmed's commanders entered the palace, the hunt became methodical. They carried lists, descriptions, priorities. They searched for Constantine XI, unaware he had already died at the walls, for the patriarch, who was captured later inside the Hagia Sophia, for noble families who could be bartered or used as political tools, and most importantly, for the unmarried women of the imperial household prizes that could cement alliances, marriages, or ransoms worth fortunes. This is the point in the story where historical documentation becomes murky and deliberately inconsistent. Ottoman archives, Byzantine eyewitnesses, Venetian merchants, and Genoese sailors all recorded pieces of what happened, each with their own biases and motives. But when their fragments are stitched together, a clearer image emerges. Theodora was discovered deep within the palace. Some reports say she was hiding in a women's chamber. Others claim she sought refuge in a small private chapel dedicated to the Virgin. That difference is monumental. If she was in a women's chamber, she was simply hiding. If she was in a sanctuary, she was invoking sacred protection or, possibly already following the path to becoming a nun. The ambiguity was almost certainly intentional, giving later historians room to reshape the narrative. Her captors were Janissaries' elite soldiers, who themselves had once been Christian boys taken by force, converted, and raised under the strictest military discipline in the empire. Their complex relationship with Christianity made their treatment of Christian captives unpredictable. Some showed unexpected kindness, others were vicious, perhaps determined to prove their loyalty by overcompensating with brutality. But when these janissaries found Theodora, they recognized instantly that she was no ordinary captive. Her clothing, even disheveled, was finely woven. Her posture reflected noble upbringing. Her face carried the unmistakable refinement Byzantine elites cultivated through careful diet, cosmetics, and grooming. She was unmistakably aristocratic. They now faced a choice. Lowest-ranking soldiers often claimed valuable captives for themselves. Women especially. A high-born girl could mean ransom money, influence, or personal possession. But taking someone too important could be fatal. Ottoman law punished disobedience harshly, and all soldiers had been warned that imperial women belonged solely to the Sultan. So instead of keeping her, the janissaries reported her capture, a rare decision noted in several chronicles. It meant they recognized the enormous danger of claiming a girl whom the Sultan might value for political reasons. Therefore, she was escorted under heavy guard through the burning streets. Imagine that march through her eyes. A girl likely meant for the cloistered life of a nun, now dragged through a city drowning in smoke and screams, past mutilated bodies, past looted homes, past women sobbing in the corners of ruined churches. Nothing, in her sheltered aristocratic upbringing, could have prepared her for such horror. She was taken to Mehmed's command tent outside the city because the Sultan had not yet entered. He was waiting, watching, allowing the fury of conquest to burn itself out before he made his ceremonial entrance as master of the new capital. He would meet Theodora there, and whatever happened in that tent would alter her future and his forever. She would have heard the muffled cries, leaking from shattered homes as she passed, women begging, pleading, being overpowered behind broken doors. The smell of burning timbers mingled with blood hung heavy in the air. And Theodora knew, because every Byzantine aristocrat knew, that young women seized during a siege rarely escaped unscathed. So when she was finally taken before Sultan Mehmed II, neither of their lives continued on the course anyone expected. Not the polished legends, not the sanitized histories. What happened between them was far more tangled, far more unsettling, and far more revealing about dominance, desire, and the impossible constraints placed upon the conquered. Mehmed II was only 21 when Constantinople felt the same age Alexander the Great had been when launching the conquest of Persia. That parallel was intentional. Mehmed had patterned his worldview on classical conquerors, studied their strategies, visited Alexander's tomb, and saw himself as heir to their legacy. But he achieved something even Alexander never accomplished. He took the ancient queen of cities, the fortress that had resisted every assault from Arab caliphates to Latin crusaders for over a millennium. By every account, Mehmed possessed extraordinary intelligence and education. He spoke several languages: Ottoman, Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin. He absorbed both Islamic scholarship and Roman imperial history. He could command armies with ruthless precision, and then spend evenings discussing art with Italian painters or inviting Byzantine scholars into his court. Two contemporaries, he embodied both the sword and the pen. According to the traditional narrative, he also displayed remarkable tolerance. After the formal 3 days of plunder permitted under wartime law, he halted the chaos, restored order, declared that surviving Greeks could practice their religion freely, and appointed a new patriarch with wide authority. This cultivated image, the enlightened conqueror, the protector of Christians, dominated Ottoman chronicles for centuries. But hidden beneath those polished accounts lies a very different portrait. Fragmented sources, private notes, and hostile foreign reports hint at a second side to Mehmed's intents. Obsessive impulses that occasionally overpowered logic and political strategy. And when Theodora was brought into his presence for the first time, something ignited inside him that would become one of the most whispered, most censored, and most disputed episodes of his life. We cannot reconstruct the conversation they shared. No formal record exists. Byzantine and Ottoman sources contradict one another intentionally. Yet, from scattered testimony, 3 facts stand firm. First, Mehmed cleared his tent. Everyone, advisors, scribes, guards, was dismissed, except for a trusted translator and a pair of loyal bodyguards. This was highly irregular. High-value prisoners were typically questioned before multiple witnesses, both to protect the Sultan from rumor and to ensure accuracy. Clearing the tent meant he sought privacy that his own ministers would have found dangerous. Second, The meeting lasted far too long. Some sources say several hours, others insist it stretched into the night, but all agree that during a moment of overwhelming military and political responsibility, when the fate of an empire needed immediate attention, Mehmed spent an extraordinary amount of time alone with a single captive teenage girl. Third, when Theodora was taken out of the tent, she was not thrown into the slave pens with the other women. She was not placed in the guarded quarters for noble prisoners awaiting ransom. Instead, she was escorted to a separate, heavily guarded pavilion furnished in a style appropriate for an aristocratic woman, a space of comfort, isolation, and surveillance, half sanctuary, half gilded cage, a status that fit no official category. So what unfolded inside that tent? This is where the competing narratives diverge sharply. Ottoman court historians, writing decades later under strict supervision, claimed that Mehmed treated Theodora with princely courtesy, that he questioned her about her lineage, marveled at her composure, and resolved to protect her out of respect for Byzantine nobility. Under their version, she exits the story entirely returned to relatives, or permitted to join a convent. The Byzantine exiles who fled to Italy told a version nearly opposite. In their accounts, Mehmed became instantly infatuated, overwhelmed by desire the moment he saw her. They claim he offered her everything, to make her an honored wife equal to his Muslim wives, to let her remain Christian, to raise her family to prominence in the Ottoman state. All she needed to do was agree to become his wife. But Theodora refused repeatedly. In their telling, she was a devout Christian girl, possibly destined for the church, who would sooner die than marry the man who destroyed her world. Yet Mehmed did not execute her, and here the narrative turns even darker. A third collection of evidence, merchant reports written by Venetians and Genoese, who had no loyalty to either Byzantium or the Ottomans, describes something far more psychologically complex. Their accounts suggest that what unfolded between Mehmed and Theodora was neither heroic romance nor immediate brutality. Instead, it became a long, tense performance of psychological domination. According to these sources, Mehmed wanted one thing above all: her willing submission. He didn't just want her presence, he wanted her consent. For him, convincing the princess of Constantinople to choose him would symbolize his total victory over Rome. Forced obedience meant nothing. Persuasion meant everything, so he placed her in a controlled limbo. She was not chained, but she was not free. She was not assaulted at first, but she was never safe. She lived in luxurious confinement, fine bedding, servants, carefully prepared meals, but with no power to refuse an order or leave the guarded tent. Mehmed visited often, daily, some said, and during those visits he alternated between persuasion and intimidation, flattering promises followed by thinly veiled threats, offers of protection followed by reminders of what happened to women who defied a conqueror. For weeks, this continued, while Mehmed reorganized the city, appointed administrators, relocated families, and repurposed the Hagia Sophia. He maintained this private obsession, a secret campaign to break down the resistance of a teenage girl whose dynasty had just collapsed. His advisors were troubled. This emerges clearly in multiple accounts. His Grand Vizier, Halal Pasha, reportedly urged him to end the fixation before it became a scandal that weakened his moral authority. Others reminded him that the Sultan already commanded an empire and a harem filled with noblewomen from across the region. Why risk everything for one defiant Byzantine girl? But the warnings meant nothing. Instead of cooling, Mehmed's fascination deepened, and the crisis that followed became so politically explosive that the Ottomans buried the details for centuries. Refugees refused to speak of them, and Western writers filled the gaps with rumor. Whatever happened next was so explosive that it was scrubbed from almost every official document that survived. What later historians agree on, despite centuries of censorship, is that sometime roughly 2 to 3 months after the conquest, Princess Theodora's circumstances shifted in a drastic and irreversible way. One day she was still being kept in the relatively luxurious quarters assigned to her. Shortly afterward, she vanished from those rooms entirely. Some accounts insist she was transferred into the inner chambers of the Topkapi harem. Others whisper that she was relocated to an isolated estate far from Constantinople, deliberately hidden from the eyes of both the palace and the people. A few of the darkest sources imply she may have been handed to one of Mehmed's most trusted commanders for reasons that were never officially explained. Then came the event, whatever it truly was, that caused a shockwave inside Mehmed's court. All the records that refer to it do so in maddeningly vague language. An incident, a misfortune, a calamity best left unspoken. The specific details have evaporated from history, erased or never recorded at all. But the aftermath is undeniable. Mehmed's obsessive interest in her abruptly ended. He would not mention her again. His advisors, who had been deeply worried about the political consequences of his fixation, suddenly ceased all discussion of her, and Theodora herself dissolved from the historical record completely, as if she had never existed. For half a millennium, this was the accepted narrative. The princess was taken in the chaos of the city's fall. The Sultan was intrigued. Something happened. She disappeared, and historians, lacking evidence, let the matter die. But the 20th century changed everything. Scholars began stumbling upon fragments, isolated clues Ottoman censors had failed to destroy, cryptic passages preserved by Byzantine refugees, encrypted reports from Venetian informants. When these scattered pieces were assembled, the picture that emerged was nothing like the sanitized legends or the simplistic horror-softened tales. Instead, it revealed something far more unsettling, a profoundly human tragedy buried beneath layers of political necessity, shame, and deliberate amnesia. In 1923, nearly 470 years after Constantinople's fall, the first major crack in the silence appeared. Halal Alsik, a meticulous Turkish historian, found an old, water-stained notebook deep in the Ottoman archives. It wasn't an official court chronicle meant to glorify a sultan. It was a private medical journal by a court physician who had treated members of Mehmed's household. One damaged section described a young woman under the doctor's care during the winter of 1453 to 1454. She isn't named directly, only referred to as the Byzantine captive, but the circumstances make the identification unmistakable. The physician writes of her deep despair, her refusal to eat, her withdrawn behavior. He notes bruises consistent with forced restraint. He details physical injuries that modern scholars recognize immediately, injuries that match what happens after prolonged violation. And then comes the line that has haunted every historian who has read it. She was pregnant. Taken together with other documents discovered in later decades, the outlines of what truly happened become clearer. After resisting Mehmed's relentless pressure for weeks or even months, Theodora eventually found herself in a position from which escape, physical or psychological, was no longer possible. Mehmed's patience deteriorated. His emotional obsession twisted into something darker. Or perhaps his advisors, fearing political instability, pushed him toward a decision he had long been trying to delay. At some point, the pretense of convincing her collapsed completely. Consent was no longer requested. It was taken. Theodora was assaulted. Whether it happened once or repeatedly is uncertain, but what followed is documented across multiple independent sources. She conceived a child. This pregnancy created a crisis of enormous proportions. Had she willingly married Mehmed and embraced Islam, such a pregnancy would have been hailed as a political triumph. An heir who united Ottoman power with Byzantine blood, a symbol that Mehmed truly was the new emperor of Rome. But a pregnancy born out of coercion, forced upon an unconverted Christian noblewoman, was the worst political nightmare imaginable. It undermined everything Mehmed was trying to project: tolerance, legitimacy, continuity with Roman authority. He wanted to be remembered as Kaiser Rom, Caesar of Rome, not as a violator of a Christian princess whose suffering could ignite rebellion, scandal, or diplomatic catastrophe. So a decision was made, quietly, secretly, ruthlessly. She had to be removed from the capital entirely, hidden where no diplomat, no court rival, no priest, and no chronicler could find her. The fragments give us glimpses, but never the full picture. A Venetian trader wrote of hearing about a highborn Greek girl being held at a remote estate in Anatolia. A Byzantine monk mentioned rumors of a princess who had taken the veil in an unnamed monastery, likely a code for forced isolation. An Ottoman financial record lists recurring payments to a household in Bursa for the upkeep of a distinguished guest, the amount far too high for an ordinary prisoner. What became of her pregnancy? This part is the darkest of all, and the sources diverge into equally grim possibilities. A Greek monk wrote decades later that the princess died in childbirth, and that the infant died shortly afterward. This version, convenient and simple, would have resolved the scandal cleanly for all parties involved. A Venetian intelligence letter, discovered much later, implies that the pregnancy was intentionally terminated. It hints with chilling vagueness, that the problem of the Byzantine maiden was resolved through medical intervention, suggesting the use of primitive, dangerous methods that would have endangered or ended her life. Some Ottoman fragments offer yet another possibility, that she carried the child to term, but the infant was removed instantly, and either disposed of, or quietly given to an obscure family to raise in secrecy, far away from any hint of royal lineage. Under that version, Theodora survived it, but only to live the rest of her life in confinement, silenced forever. There is even a fourth possibility, whispered in a handful of obscure Italian sources, that she somehow escaped her captors and reached a Greek refugee community in Italy. But these mentions are tenuous, unverifiable, and likely born of hopeful imagination rather than fact. What we do know beyond all doubts is that by the year 1455, Princess Theodora had been erased, not merely lost. Erased. No Ottoman records mention her again. Byzantine refugee texts that originally told parts of her story removed her name in later copies, replacing it with empty lines or euphemisms. Western documents that had once alluded to the scandal were quietly edited, or corrected in revised editions. It was a coordinated disappearance. Why? Because her existence challenged every side's preferred version of history. For the Ottomans, she exposed the cracks in Mehmed's cultivated image of restraint and magnanimity. For the Byzantines, she embodied the humiliation and helplessness they were desperate to forget. For Western powers, her story was too complex, too tragic, too human to fit their simplistic portrayals of Mehmed as either a barbaric tyrant or an enlightened ruler, so they erased her. For 5 centuries, she lived only in scattered fragments, marginal notes, and damaged manuscripts. But what that erasure reveals is invaluable. History is not just written by the victors, it is shaped by those who benefit from forgetting. Theodora's story was inconvenient for everyone, and so they buried her. We do not know if she died in childbirth, was killed to hide the scandal, escaped into anonymity, or lived her remaining years in forced seclusion. But we do know this: she was a young woman trapped in an impossible political nightmare. Every path available to her led to loss. She resisted for as long as humanly possible, till resistance was no longer something she was allowed. Her suffering was buried by those who had the power to decide what deserved to be remembered, but not anymore. Because the fall of Constantinople was not glorious for everyone. For thousands of unnamed women and, especially for Princess Theodora, it marked the beginning of a horror the world chose to ignore. They deserve better. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their truth spoken aloud, even when it forces us to confront the darkest corners of our history. Like, subscribe, comment Theodora, share this so her name is not erased again. Because real victory isn't in forcing the world to forget. It's in making sure the world remembers.